And we'd like to welcome you to this session of our conference. So our first speaker is Michelle Graabek. She's a PhD researcher at the European University Institute in the Department of History and Civilization. Her key research interest lies in cultural identity and community among Scandinavian migrant groups, women's religious history, and transnational history. Her current research focuses on culture and community among Danish Latter-day Saint immigrant women in Utah during the late 19th century. Michelle has a BA in archaeology from the University of Reading and an MA in cultural heritage studies from the University College London, where she developed her research interests and interdisciplinary research skills. Before starting her PhD, Michelle worked in the cultural heritage sector in England for several years, managing education and event programs at various historic houses with a great passion for access to heritage and the arts. Let's give a warm applause to Michelle Graabek.
Thank you very much. Let me see if this works. There we go. So, this is my father, Bjorn Grobek, on the left here. He is the one who gifted me with a love of history. Doing family history on Family Search one day, my father was faced with the following on the right. Your relative immigrated to America for religious freedom. While this feature is clearly designed to get people engaged with their family history, this was a very alienating experience for him. He felt this statement was incorrect, as Rasimine Christensen, featured here, was born in 1859, 10 years after the Danish Constitution granted Danish citizens many civil liberties, including religious freedom, which makes your relative immigrated to America for religious freedom a false statement. My father came away feeling that this was designed for an American audience of pioneer descendants intrigued by the trails of their ancestors, not him as a Dane aware of his own constitutional history. He felt strongly enough about it that he sent an email to Family Search where he wrote, "My membership of the church means a lot to me, and if asked what defines me, it is more important than my nationality. But I am also a proud Dane. Maybe I'm being touchy, but the quoted sentence to me implies that the country of your relative sucks. She had to come to America for real freedom." From a young age, as a Latter-day Saint in Denmark in Sunday school and seminary lessons, I heard rhetoric about how the US Constitution was inspired by God and how the US was the promised land, which I'm in no way implying is untrue. Yet I was never taught or had access to resources to celebrate the history of the church in my own country. So my presentation has two aims today. First, to present the experience of Danish Latter-day Saints in negotiating religious freedom in Denmark in the early 1850s. Second, to highlight the issue that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints needs to be more aware of how we present global history. Yes, the US at the time of Joseph Smith was exceptional in how there was an environment prepared for the church to come forth. However, Denmark, in my opinion, is also an example of a country prepared at the right time and place for the church to come forth, in large part because of the timing of religious freedom's inclusion in the Danish Constitution. Prior to the 1849 Danish Constitution, church and state in Denmark were one. Confirmation in the Danish Lutheran Church was, at age 14, marked one's Danish citizenship. Those who were not Lutheran were predominantly foreign immigrants, such as Jews and German Catholics. These groups were granted royal concession as recognized for foreign religious groups, but not given full rights as Danish citizens. To be Danish was to be Lutheran. However, in the 1830s and 40s, there began to be increasing public debate in Denmark about freedom of conscience, that the state should respect personal freedom in its people's private, spiritual, and religious lives. This expanded into discussions on freedom of faith and religious practice, and the separation of church and state, inspired by what was in Denmark referred to as French, English, and American models. Discussions on religious freedom in Denmark became particularly relevant with the establishment of an illegal Baptist congregation in Copenhagen in 1839. The leader of Copenhagen's Baptist congregation, Peter Christian Münster, pictured here, became instrumental in demanding religious freedom in Denmark. At this time, Denmark had 4 provincial assemblies which advised the King of Denmark. These assemblies were a way for Danes to raise issues to the king through petitions to their provincial assembly. So on 16th July 1840, Münster wrote to his local provincial assembly in Roskilde a petition for the full religious freedom for Denmark. Here he wrote, "When I dare make the present proposal of the representatives of the Danish people, the High Provincial Assembly, and ask for religious freedom for Denmark, as it has in England, then I dare hope that the Assembly will not see any other reason on my part for this proposal than this. Love for my fatherland, in that I desire all the happiness and blessing, temporal and spiritual, which true freedom can bestow, develop, and establish." In his petition, Münster asked for Denmark to have religious freedom as modelled by England and the US. He argued that religious plurality brought great blessings, including greatness, prosperity, and opportunity for development, and greater religious engagement. Sadly, the Provincial Assembly decided to set the petition aside, noting that no one found reason to recommend it for reading. However, Münster in his petition had written that regardless of whether there was religious freedom in Denmark, he would take it for himself and practice his religion as a Baptist. Over the next 5 years, between 1840 and 1845, Münster would be imprisoned 5 times for his religious practice, which put together added up to about 2 years of imprisonment. From prison, between 1840 to 1842, he wrote 3 letters to the King of Denmark petitioning for religious freedom. As a result, in December 1842, a law titled Baptistplakaten was announced, providing the Baptists with broader religious tolerance. It declared that religious freedom could not be granted to the Baptist, though certain allowances could be made for them to worship God in accordance with their own views. These allowed the Baptists to have a congregation in Copenhagen and to hold church meetings, however demanded that their children had to be baptized in the state Lutheran Church. This led to what is known as the Baptist Crisis of 1842, where the Danish Lutheran Church pursued the forced infant baptism of Baptist children. Several Lutheran priests decided that forced infant baptism was against their conscience and refused to do so. The liberal press in Denmark also sided with the Baptists. The vocal criticism of Baptistplakaten led to Amnestyplakaten in June 1848, which stated that an amnesty be granted to those who may be persecuted or convicted for holding religious services or performing baptisms. This was followed by other laws that provided greater religious tolerance in Denmark. These events were key to religious freedom being included in the drafting of the Danish Constitution. Münster's Baptist congregation would also be key to the success of the early Latter-day Saint missionaries in Denmark, as many of the congregation were the first to join the Church of Jesus Christ in Denmark. So on 5th of June 1849, King Frederick VII of Denmark signed the Constitution of Denmark, making Denmark a constitutional monarchy, a constitution which also granted religious freedom. The Danish Constitution's articles regarding religion became the following, and I'm just going to read Articles 81 and 84, as they were particularly relevant to the Latter-day Saints. Citizens have the right to gather together in order to worship God in a way that is consistent with their beliefs, provided that nothing is taught or done that is contrary to moral or public order. No one can be deprived of access to the full enjoyment of civil and political rights because of his faith, or evade the fulfillment of any ordinary civic duty. 4 months later, in Salt Lake City, on 6th of October in General Conference, Erastus Snow and Peter Ort Hansen were called to serve missions in Denmark. They arrived the following year in 1850. Church leadership in Salt Lake City and the missionaries they sent were themselves unaware of the political and constitutional developments that had occurred in Denmark in the years before they arrived. In Copenhagen, Erastus Snow, pictured here, and Peter Hansen rented a room from a young woman, and Erastus Snow wrote in his journal, "Captain Simpson, the father of the young lady before mentioned, called and spent the afternoon with us. Being an old and experienced officer in the government service, he had acquired a sufficient knowledge of the English language to carry on a conversation, and we found to be a gentleman quite candid and liberal in his views and feelings, and from him we obtained much desirable information relative to the state of affairs in this country. During the recent revolutions in Europe, an important political change had taken place in Denmark in favor of democratic principles. The king had granted a constitution, or ground law, which was proclaimed June 5, 1849. The new constitution also provides for the extension of the liberty of the people and religious toleration under certain regulations and restrictions to be hereafter defined by the legislator. Thus we saw that the Lord had been preparing the way before us in a manner that we knew not of." As a result of the religious freedom in Denmark, the headquarters of the Scandinavian mission was established in Copenhagen. On 15th September 1850, the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints was organized in Copenhagen, consisting of 50 members, and the missionaries presented the church to the Danish Minister of Culture and a board of magistrates, obtaining permission to procure a place of worship and hold meetings. Erastus Snow initially had a somewhat rosy view of the religious freedom and tolerance the Constitution would grant them. This would prove to be a somewhat naive belief. While religious freedom sounded nice in theory and on paper in the Constitution, learning what this meant in practice was a gradual uphill learning curve that experienced resistance along the way. In July 1851, Erastus Snow recognized this in a letter he wrote to a fellow Danish missionary. Denmark is not England nor America. Religious liberty is not grounded in the hearts of the people. In another letter to the First Presidency in December 1851, Erastus Snow wrote, "The Danish Constitution guarantees the rights, but when you accept Copenhagen and the principal merchant towns, it is scarcely known that such a right exists. We have to preach the Constitution to prepare the way for the Book of Mormon." Just as the Baptists had played a key role in making the Danes develop religious tolerance, I would argue that the Latter-day Saints would play a key role in making the Danes discuss and debate what religious freedom looked like in practice. As the Church of Jesus Christ grew in Denmark in the early 1850s, so did the persecution in the form of mobs who attacked missionaries, church meetings, and Latter-day Saints' homes. The Latter-day Saints appealed to the police, who occasionally stepped in, mostly when mobs caused destruction of property. However, for the most part, such appeals were ignored. Inaction from the police was partially a result of confusion about the definition of religious freedom in the Constitution and how this was to be practiced and implemented. In his journal, Erastus Snow wrote, "The Rigsdagen Parliament have not yet enacted the laws necessary for carrying into execution the liberal provisions of the Constitution with regard to religion, and the old laws are still liable to be enforced." The persecution of Latter-day Saints was worst in Aalborg, Denmark in 1851, where both the local Lutheran Bishop Fogtmann and Chief of Police Johnson actively worked against the Latter-day Saints. In July 1851, Aalborg Saints submitted a formal letter complaint to the Danish government, listing their complaints against Chief of Police Johnson, including that he had banned the Latter-day Saints from holding public meetings, banned them from establishing a school, and that he had not acted to protect them against violent persecution and mobs. This, they argued, denied them their constitutional right of freedom of religion. As persecution continued in 1852, the Danish Latter-day Saints agreed to write a petition to appeal to the Danish Parliament for the protection of freedom to worship as was granted in the Danish Constitution. I have not found specific evidence that the Danish Latter-day Saints were purposefully following the pattern of the Saints in Missouri in how they responded, but their response did follow a similar pattern outlined in Doctrine and Covenants section 101. It is my will that they should continue to importune for redress and redemption by the hands of those who are placed as rulers and are in authority over you. According to the laws and constitution of the people, I have suffered to be established and should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh according to the just and holy principles. The translated Doctrine and Covenants had just been published in Denmark the same month, February 1852. So it's quite plausible that during the translation process, this section had gained particular meaning to the Danish Latter-day Saints, and they chose to apply it to their own situation. Just as the Saints in Missouri sought redress by petitioning Missouri Governor Daniel Dunklin and US President Andrew Jackson, the Danish Saints wrote a petition addressed to the Danish Parliament and the King, signed by 850 saints, sent on 15th March 1852. The petition opens, "As faithful subjects of Denmark, we humbly address ourselves with loving trust to our beloved King and his noble council, as a representative for the Latter-day Saints and undersigned subjects. We ask to be heard on the following subject: that our persons, estates, and property may be protected in our worship of God, according to the freedom granted us in Articles 1881 of the Constitution." The Latter-day Saints here emphasize their constitutional rights. In this petition, they detailed instances of persecution they had suffered, including their experiences in Aalborg and their complaints to Chief of Police Johnson, and continued to list similar violent persecutions and destruction of property they had suffered in other areas of Denmark. They emphasized the lack of protection from authorities and that none of the attackers had been arrested or property damage financially compensated, and those who had gone to the authorities were often treated as the guilty party. Sadly, similar to how the petitions in Missouri were unsuccessful, this petition was never formally acknowledged by the Danish Parliament. Apparently, some members of Parliament did promise to address the Saints' petition and cause. However, shortly after the submission of the petition, Parliament broke for recess for Easter, and the petition was never raised again after the break. This, however, did not mean the Latter-day Saints weren't discussed in the Danish Parliament. In the early 1850s, the Mormon issue was raised in Parliament on several occasions, often with the desire to curb its spread or to discuss whether constitutional religious freedom applied to them at all. For example, one newspaper reported on a parliamentary meeting on 16th July 1853. At the Folketing's Saturday meeting on 16th July, Councillor of Justice Hoff asked the Minister of Culture whether the government had taken or intended to take measures against the spread of Mormonism. The Minister of Culture's answer seemed to be approximately the following. The government was not empowered to prevent the preaching of Mormonism, but merely to control that its followers did nothing against order and morality. In this, the Minister of Culture was pretty much just quoting the wording of the Danish Constitution, Article 81. The line here, "Nothing is taught or done that is contrary to moral or public order," was an oft-quoted line, as moral or public order was in many ways up for interpretation. The practice of polygamy was one area that many felt would fit the bill as contrary to moral or public order, after 1853, when it was written about in the Latter-day Saint publication Scandinavian Stjerne. In January 1854, the Lutheran Bishop of Lolland-Falster, Ditlev Gotthard Monrad, who is pictured here, on the left, wrote a memorandum on the Latter-day Saints to the Minister of Church and School Affairs. Before becoming the Bishop of Lolland-Falster, Monrad had had a key role in composing the draft of the Danish Constitution, to the extent that he's widely regarded as the father of the Danish Constitution, and was himself a supporter of religious freedom. However, in the conclusion of his 1854 memorandum on the Latter-day Saints, he suggested that their teachings on polygamy excluded them from the protection of the Constitution, including copies of Scandinavian Stjerne as evidence. In April 1854, a pastor, H.C. Graabek, wrote an article stating that the Latter-day Saints boldly defended polygamy, and he accused some Latter-day Saints, specifically in Vendsyssel, of living polygamously. As a result, the police in Copenhagen and the local Lutheran bishop and government officials responsible for Vendsyssel were asked to investigate the Latter-day Saints for the practice of polygamy. It was reported that there was no such practice occurring in Denmark. Despite these examples, that the Latter-day Saints didn't receive protection or compensation for persecution, the Danish Constitution in many ways did work in their favour and protected their right to religious freedom. The Minister of Culture made it clear that the Danish government would not obstruct or restrict the Latter-day Saints on religious grounds. Police Chief Johnson Aalborg was instructed by the Minister of Culture to restore the Saints their privileges to hold church meetings and proselyte. While various investigations were made into the Latter-day Saints, none of these produced evidence that was used to exclude them from the practice of religious freedom. Despite calls from some to ban or otherwise restrict the activities of the Church of Jesus Christ by law, many, both in the Danish Parliament and the press and the Lutheran Church, spoke and wrote in favour of religious freedom and argued that to do so would be unconstitutional. Regarding polygamy, the Danish government adopted an attitude that as long as polygamy wasn't actively practiced in Denmark, then they could talk and write about it pretty much all they liked. This was exemplified when in 1880, the US Secretary of State asked Denmark to prevent the emigration of Latter-day Saints on the basis of polygamy. The Danish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Otto Rosenørn, refused to do so and wrote to the US Secretary of State that joining the Mormon community can in no wise be likened to the resolution to contract polygamous alliances. In a letter to the First Presidency of the Church on 17th August 1850, Erastus Snow wrote that if the missionaries had arrived before the Constitution, the law would have been against us in all probability. He reiterated this in a letter to President Brigham Young on 10th July 1851, that probably an earlier mission to that country would have proved a failure. To Erastus Snow, it was clear that while the concept of religious freedom in the Danish Constitution was a very young and fledgling thing, it was also what enabled the Church to establish, grow, and succeed in Denmark. I'm now going to fast forward to the present day. At General Conference April 2021, President Dallin H. Oaks said, "I have felt to speak about the inspired Constitution of the United States. This Constitution is of special importance to our members in the United States, but is also a common heritage of constitutions around the world." I must confess that I mentally switched off and felt this talk wasn't aimed at me. Having consequently reread it, it is an excellent talk, and I recognize the US Constitution does form a common heritage of constitutions, including the Danish Constitution. However, if you search the word Constitution on churchofjesuschrist.org, you would be tempted to believe that there only exists the US Constitution. In 1976, Ezra Taft Benson gave a general conference titled The Constitution, a Glorious Standard. And I want to emphasize the Constitution because it rather makes it sound like it's the only one. Dallin H. Oak's recent general conference address was titled Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution. And I must confess that I've never thought of the US Constitution as mine. And I, to some extent, felt excluded from the hour that I was certain was meant to represent all Latter-day Saints. An Australian member, Marjorie Newton, wrote in 1991, "No Latter-day Saint would argue with the premise that America is a choice land, a promised land. Problems arise when American Latter-day Saints assume that America is the only choice land. That because the gospel was restored in America, American culture is also better than any other, and that therefore the church has a mission not only to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, but to spread the gospel of Americanism." When my father described his experience with family search, writing, "Maybe I'm being touchy, but the quoted sentence to me implies that the country of relative sucks," his experience was sadly not unique. In fact, I recently had another experience with family search, pictured here, where I was informed that one of my ancestors, Man Henstetter, another distant cousin who joined the Church of Jesus Christ, left her homeland to build a better life, which concerned me in how the wording here ascribed a value, with America cast as the better choice. I would argue that if the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints truly wants to create an identity as an international church, we must consciously think about how we change the language we use and the way we narrate global history. And that includes constitutional history. In some ways, this can be easily fixed by considering our language more carefully. Ezra Taft Benson's talk could be titled The American Constitution, recognizing that it's not the only one. Man Henstetter could be building a new or a different life, therefore not attributing value judgments to her decision-making process. With Rasmina Christensen, pictured here, who I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we can recognize that she did in fact already have religious freedom, and the decision to immigrate to Utah was more specific to gather with the saints in Zion. In 2 Nephi 29:7 we read, "Know ye not that there are more nations than one? Know ye not that I, the Lord your God, have created all men, and that I remember those who are upon the isles of the sea?" It was one of my favorite scriptures growing up because to me, Denmark was the Isles of the Sea. When the Church of Jesus Christ speaks of constitutional history, it must itself remember those who are upon the Isles of the Sea and reflect and represent that there are more nations than one. The Church has, over the last several years, begun to include more global narratives, including in its historical narrative, church material, and general conference talks, but still has a way to go. Many Danes fought for the inclusion of religious freedom in the Danish Constitution of 1849. In doing so, I, as not just an academic, but as a Latter-day Saint, believe that they were inspired by God. I see God's hand inspiring a mission call to Erastus Snow and Peter Henson only 4 months after that divinely inspired constitution, to borrow language used about the US Constitution. And I want to close with Erastus Snow's words in his diary, "Thus we saw that the Lord had been preparing the way before us in a manner that we knew not of." Thank you.
So we have about a dozen minutes for questions. My colleague, Robert Freeman, is going to have a microphone that he'll be passing around, and we'll ask both Michelle and Julie to respond to the questions here at the stand so you can hear them. So if you'll state your name and, clearly into the microphone what your question is, and ask, and just mention which of these speakers you have the question for. Okay? Great.
I'm interested in the dynamics of the families in Denmark, as they noted that some of their children or some of their cousins left and some did not. And did those who stay, some of them say, I love the gospel, but I can't, I need to stay with my... Do we have any information that kind of shows the struggle that some of them were, and that they didn't want to, violate their family members by joining this new church or by leaving? Any comments about that? Might be interesting.
So, as was mentioned earlier, I apart from that, actually, I talk about the Constitution. I usually specifically study Danish women. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the decision-making process of choosing to become a Latter-day Saint. Because from a lot of these Danish women's accounts, there definitely is a clear struggle and very much an awareness that this is something that is going to alienate them from their communities and from their families. So it definitely is part of the decision-making process that people who join the Church of Denmark have to go through is how is my family going to react, and is that something that is worthwhile? So it's definitely part of the decision-making process, and it's interesting to see how they go through, talk about this awareness and how they have to go through a lot of study and prayer to decide to join the Mormon Church. And there definitely is people who decide that they're not going to join the church because of family commitments of various kinds.
So you can probably both speak to this, but specifically, Michelle, there was the quote from Erastus Snow where he said that there were two. They were preaching the Constitution in order to get those rights, and that the local legal precedent was kind of lagging behind the constitutional precedent. Do you think that the continued preaching, kind of like the very defiant arrest us if you have to preaching that was going on, especially during that early period, do you think that was an attempt maybe to kind of civil disobedience, get our constitutional rights in the same way that maybe the Reynolds case in the U.S. is happening? Or is there something else going on there? Because Julie, you called it something about like the frustration of the lay local people, but there is legal intervention, right? They are actually being arrested, being tried, being imprisoned, being banished. Those kinds of things are happening. So what's going on there? Is that, I know that's kind of a complicated question, but can you speak to that?
So I wouldn't say that the decision to keep proselyting is an act of civil disobedience for the Danish missionaries. They definitely feel very strongly themselves that this is our constitutional right. We're just sticking to what the law is. What does happen in Denmark is that they do try to start stopping missionary work through other means that are not religious. It's not religious persecution. They start arresting them for vagrancy a lot, as an attempt to curb Mormonism without sort of going on, without stopping their religious freedom. But it definitely is an interesting point. There definitely is this lag in terms of we have this constitution, but what does that actually mean in practice? And especially for more rural police forces, there's definitely this sense of we don't actually know what this means, and we're just going to stick to what we used to do. And yeah, so the early 1850s are quite interesting in that lag and learning what that means and how it's actually going to look in practice. And I would argue that the Latter-day Saints are very much part of forcing the Danes to recognize, okay, what does this actually look like in practice?
So, Michelle, I appreciated the notes that you made, of course, of that these members did not leave to better their lives or to obtain religious freedom and so forth. But it brought to my mind the question of, one, presumably the reason that they left was to join the Saints. And I guess I'm wondering, among other religious populations, that in the wake of the Constitution and this change that was made with respect to religious freedom, were there other religious populations where there were large exoduses of people to new religious, traditions, to new religious identities that then left Denmark and came to other locations?
So in the 19th century, the Church of Jesus Christ is obviously quite interesting because that the idea of gathering is a huge part of the Church's doctrine. And at that time, obviously gathering is very much part of our doctrine today, but at the time it was very much a physical gathering. We're all going to go to Utah, and that is, we're preparing for the second coming. It is very unique in Denmark as a religious group in that sense. Interestingly, if you ever read Danish books that are about migration during this time period, it's you will notice that we talk about all these Danish migration patterns, and then there's these Mormons who are doing something completely different, and they just don't fit the regular migration narrative of Denmark in the 19th century. They're different for various reasons. It's the religious motivation, but it's also there's a much higher percentage of women that migrate. There's more children that are part of that migration. And the fact that they all end up in one place. Most other Danish migrants that go to the US pretty much spread throughout the US. It's not really a center. There are a lot that go to Wisconsin, but apart from that, they pretty much spread throughout the US. They're pretty unique in the religious motivation, the high percentage of women, and the fact they all go to one place. There's not really any other religious groups in Denmark during this time that do that.
Our time is up. Thank you for being a great audience, your excellent questions. And I would like to again thank Michelle and Julie for exceptional papers. I think they did a great job. And if we were in Denmark, we'd say tusind tak, 1,000 thanks. Let's give them a round of applause. Julie, great job. And we have a little time in between, so maybe you may want to visit with them one-on-one if you didn't get your questions answered. Thank you.